Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of our Net Zero Policy Network. We are delighted you all could make it so promptly today. We'll just wait a couple more minutes for those who are a little less prompt, as they are welcome to our network as well, and then we'll get started. And thanks for saying hi in the chat. Well, we have a packed agenda today, so I'm going to kick us off, and I don't think anyone will mind catching up with us if they join a little bit later. My name is Kaya Axelson, and I'm the head of policy and partnerships at Oxford Net Zero, which is a university-wide research program at Oxford thinking about pathways to net zero. And as the net zero landscape has moved from mobilization to standardization to now implementation, we see the pivot towards net zero policy as a critical turn in ensuring that there are clear and fair ground rules that we're all following similarly for a race to the top on this great transition. And so we have paired up today with Normative, many partners across the groups, NGOs, civil society, government, academia, and business who are working towards clear and fair and aligned ground rules for the net zero economy. And seeing a need for a network in the landscape to broadcast, share information, and work together, we thought we would try something. And so today we're extremely excited to have you all at the launch of what we hope will become a thriving community, sharing information and advancing towards a common goal across jurisdictions and domains internationally. I'm going to just go through a little bit of housekeeping today. We'd really like this to be an active part of an active program. So we encourage continued conversation in the chat. We also, of course, have a amazing lineup of, I don't want to call them speakers. I think, we're all participants here. We really see this as a network. And so this is more of a two-way street, but we did want to sort of show off some thinking about the network and about why we need a network like this. And so today we have some fabulous speakers. My partner in organizing this event today is Dr. Alexander Schmidt, Head of Science, Sustainability, and Climate Research at Normative, which, if you don't already know, is an incredible company helping other companies to decarbonize and understand this complex policy landscape. We are also very lucky today to have a visit from David Shukman, who is a visiting professor at LSE and advisor to us at the Smith School in Oxford. David has an incredible career and is probably one of the most learned people on climate, kind of reporting on climate with the BBC for decades. We're very pleased to have David's geopolitical analysis to contextualize this conversation today. We have Dr. Ritvika Sengupta, who's the Net Zero Policy Manager at the British Standards Institute, working with our 2050 World Programme, which is focusing on the role that standards can play in improving interoperability and coherence in the policy landscape. And last but not least, Julie Siegel, who's a Senior Manager at Climate Finance Environmental Defence Canada, who's going to tell us some of her recent victories, I will call them victories, in Canada, aligning climate finance and regulation. So we're delighted to have you all today, but we also wanted to get a sense a little bit of who else is in the room kicking off this network. So we'll have a 1-hour conversation. The webinar will be recorded, so keep that in mind if you're sharing anything. We'd like you to submit questions throughout, and we will collect them in response. So if you just have any comments or strategic advice or questions throughout the session, please put them into the Q&A. And then there'll be a post-webinar survey, because part of the purpose of this is to set the strategy for the network. So I am going to first start us off before kind of we set the stage on the landscape and some trends we're seeing in net zero policy and regulation. I just wanted to get a sense of who's here with us today across the different stakeholder groups. So we're going to start a poll, and you can also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat throughout. I'm not sure if I have to do the poll. If you could keep introducing yourself in the chat, and maybe just say, are you from academia? Are you from the private sector? Are you from the public sector? Are you working on policy within government? Or are you none of those groups?
The poll is actually also available in the polls tab. So if you just have a look, everyone, at the kind of right-hand side of your screen, you see your polls, and there you can access the poll now to input your response.
Well, this is very balanced today. We have some, I think it's not surprising given that we have some leader in the private sector organizing this panel. We have some strong representation of people wanting to create an ambition loop in the private sector. Also not surprising, our second most popular category is academia. We also have some strong support from civil society, but I'm also seeing that perhaps our network needs to expand in the standard setting and policymaking space. So this really helps us to understand kind of who we are today and how that might inform our strategy. Thank you very much for voting in the poll. Now I'll just go on to talk a little bit about kind of why we thought it was important, given the role of net zero policy and regulation globally and the way that it's expanding, it was important for us to kick off this network. So about a year ago, my team in Oxford thought, you know, there's a lot of people tracking net zero regulation and policy, but we're going to hone in on a few key areas where some of the net zero standards that we've been working on can show up and be referenced in net zero policy and regulation. So one of those areas is some of the claims legislation that we've seen, the EU claims legislation that came out recently being a prime example. That basically says when companies are or aren't allowed to say that they are net zero or like terms. And that's a really interesting example of the standards being applied very directly. Then there's a huge and growing area that I'm sure many are familiar with, especially since we have so many private sector leaders today around disclosure. I'm sure that's something that you're thinking about regularly, what you have to disclose and how you get that all prepared. There, of course, has been, on the back of the disclosure conversation, a great discussion on how we define credible transition plans. And procurement is also an area we see governments being able to lead the way with government initiatives like the Net Zero Government Initiative, putting out policies as terms of how the government spends its own money. And we're doing research across how procurement laws are being applied differently in terms of how net zero is expected to be achieved by those getting bids from the government. So our research shows us roughly that there has been a huge growth in the development of net zero regulation and policy, 11 times since 2016, with 75% of G20 members having implemented one of these kind of regulatory domains in some form or another. But our analysis also suggests that one of the challenges that comes along with this exciting development is, of course, interoperability, companies having to respond to different expectations in different jurisdictions, or even within the same jurisdiction, different policy domains saying different things. We also see that rigor is really clearly important. If policies, say taxonomies, are defining something as green that perhaps might not be green, oil and gas, for example, this can drive more investment in the fossil fuel industry than, say, is perhaps aligned to the Paris Agreement. And so we need policies to be keeping to the level of rigor that aligns to our climate targets internationally and domestically. And then we're also seeing some concerns around the way some of these policies will have cross-border implications and raise concerns for equity and fairness. So that's just a really brief primer to say that there's a lot of ground for us to cover in this network and exchange notes on. It's also a theory of change that our kind of wider community operates on, that there's a potential ambition loop between business climate action and government climate policy. As businesses have, as we've seen, set ambitious science-based targets, they are responding to new challenges as to how they develop their business models, and there are plenty of externalities that need to ultimately be met through policy reform in order for them to meet their targets. Ideally, these arrows go this direction rather than the other way around, but research is mixed as to which direction the arrows are going on different policy topics. It's our aim, of course, to activate the ambition loop. And so in coordination with a net zero policy community, which is a group of around 50 NGOs that we meet with regularly, we are helping to define campaigns, consultation opportunities, and align advocacy between businesses and governments so that we can be working together and moving the arrows in the direction to the right. We also will be amplifying your efforts as part of this network. And so it's our hope that you will feed us information about some exciting advocacy and climate policy opportunities, consultations, and that can be something that we help to broadcast. Importantly, the role of business has been rather underappreciated, even though business can be such a powerful lever for policy change. And I would argue even one of the most necessary levers for shifting the ambition in the right direction and at the pace that we need. So I'm going to hand over to our private sector leader today, although he's also very much a scientist. Dr. Alexander Schmidt, would you share a little bit about the business perspective and why we started this network?
Thank you so much, Kaya, and welcome from my side as well. Kaya already quickly introduced me. I'm coming from Normative, heading there our science, sustainability, and climate research function. And the capacity, I work a lot together with Kaya, luckily now since quite some time, and very happily now launching this network together. And as Kaya already pointed out, private sector is really, really crucial. Ultimately, of course, we talk about policies here, but policies themselves don't reduce emissions, right? We need to have ultimately the private sector very much on board, and we need to make sure policies are aligned with the private sector and also, to be honest, what they can deliver on. So we did a study end of last year that shows actually that 78% of global industry emissions are actually right now covered by large enterprises' net zero commitments. So just envision this, like almost 80% we could reduce, we hopefully will reduce by just the existing commitments. At the same time, we also showed that companies are struggling to translate these voluntary commitments into results, into action, because honestly, committing is rather easy, but delivering on results is of course hard. And doesn't mean they are not right now willing to do so, but they might be just unable to do so. So we need to set the right incentive structure, but also the right environment for everyone to have a level playing field to translate the voluntary commitments into real action. So how can we help businesses to get better informed, to comply with what is right now quite a patchwork of different regulations, especially if you are internationally operating a company? You will have to comply with multiple regionally different legislation. So that's a huge challenge for them. So we want with this network to directly engage with business leaders. Luckily, our poll at the entry showed that we have the interest, at least from the private sector here in this webinar represented, and we hope we continue to do so. And yeah, so that's why we launched this network. We will offer quarterly webinars. This is the launch event, and afterwards we have more dedicated webinars to certain topic areas. We're also going to find on the platform, which we're going to share with you, also a link throughout the whole conversation we have here. You find a bulletin for information sharing. And of course, we want to have this cross-sector audience of policymakers, NGOs, business leaders to really exchange information, to learn from each other and to shape policy moving forward. So we always have some ask of the audience for our overall, both webinar and events. And in this case, for today, it's straightforward. It is join the network. Come on board. You see the link netzeropolicy.net. And it's a super easy registration form we would ask you to fill in to connect with us, to stay informed on what is on our agenda, and to participate in the process that we have just mapped out. So to also better understand where actually you're coming from in terms of your interest, your needs, I would like to start a second poll. So now that we all are getting a bit more familiar with the platform we are on here, you will now see a second poll launched in the poll tab, where we ask you, why actually are you here? Not that you're not welcome, but what are you doing here? So what do you want with the network? I want to engage in this network by, let us know, staying up to date about net zero policy through our newsletters, for example, quarterly updates and webinars, finding out about public consultations, learning about advocacy opportunities, and or sharing your own contributions and your own learnings. With this, you really help us to also shape better where we put more emphasis on, or to just get to know a bit better where you are coming from. Because ultimately, this platform is for you. This platform is, we are kind of facilitating the exchange between all of you here. So let's see. And please keep voting, keep submitting your responses. What I see right now is that we have a close race between staying up to date. That speaks to, you want to be informed about policy activities and you want to attend, to participate in the webinars. Consultations are also relevant. And of course, sharing your own contributions and learnings. Interesting. So we're going to definitely take this on board. So the information piece and the attendance in webinars. We definitely also want to encourage a proactive element here where you can get in, interact with policymakers. So we'll keep those in mind. Thank you everyone for responding. And with this, I would like to hand it back to Kaya.
Thanks so much, Alex, and everyone. That's really helpful for us, and just helpful to know even that having a quarterly call where we talk about the latest policy and regulation is helpful to folks. I know it's helpful to me in my work. So I'm actually going to go back to our first speaker, who's going to help us set the stage and zoom out. David Shukman comes to us after 40 years as a leading correspondent for BBC News, as the BBC's first ever science editor, which I think is just incredible. I'm hoping that's correct from your bio, David. Focusing on explaining to the public the most complex questions, especially climate change. And David, as I mentioned, works with LSE and luckily us at the Smith School in Oxford. David, you and I were having a fascinating discussion the other day about the geopolitical and domestic issues around net zero. They're far from straightforward. This is not an easy landscape for us to be working on. And at the same time, policy and regulation is taking off. The horse has definitely left the stables. And I'm hearing words like the inevitable policy response to climate change. There's sort of two different narratives here. You've been a journalist for many years studying great transitions through the weather, the kind of turbulent weather of political change. I have kind of two questions for you. What do you see as the greatest policy and political barriers to the net zero transition? And how can we activate the ambition loop to see our way through those?
Well, look, thank you for having me. And it's terrific to see the enthusiasm and the scale of support for this initiative. So congratulations to all of you. I think I'll try to answer your question in a couple of different ways. It seems to me that whenever the words net zero and policy sort of appear together, it's really, really important, I think, particularly with a wider audience, to ground the discussion in the realities of climate change. And I think that's partly to do with language and partly to do with subject matter. And I think for a lot of people, the news this morning from Copernicus about now 10 months in a row with record temperatures doesn't cut through, frankly. I think it's better to talk in terms of really quite gritty, practical examples, and that every discussion about net zero should include some of this. So we're coming up to the second anniversary of the day, Britain's hottest day, 40 degrees plus, July the 19th, 2022, when London ran out of fire engines. There were so many fires in a great ring around the capital, and where the fire crews turned up to fires to connect their hoses to the water mains and didn't get enough water because there was a drought. So when people, I think, talk about climate change, I think we need to find new narratives which actually resonate with people. Also on that day, and I find that this story surprises and shocks people, but I think hopefully in a positive way, one of the biggest hospitals in London, the computer server holding all the patient records overheated, which initially wasn't a problem because the backup kicked in, but then that overheated. And it took them 3 months to sort out the ensuing mess. And I think when these sorts of stories are shared, it produces a different reaction, and possibly for people who aren't convinced as to why net zero matters, when they hear this kind of thing, I'm finding in my engagement that it does make a difference. Kaya, you also asked about barriers. I think one that we really need to be aware of, and it's something that Isaac Newton would recognize, was it Forson's reaction, action and reaction. I mean, for every bold, ambitious, useful, progressive step forward on the net zero agenda, there's a reaction. And we all know who I'm referring to, and they're extremely motivated, vested interests always are. And the greater the pressures, the greater the reaction. And I think it's just worth bearing in mind that we're looking now really at a very well-funded, extremely intelligently staffed ecosystem of resistance. And I know people in oil and gas and like talking to them, and I know there are arguments about engagement or divestment, but that's a fact. Every step forward is met and resisted, and that needs to be thought through, and people, I think everybody in this space needs to be aware of. So I've been a bit gloomy. Final point, though, to get to one of your questions. Something that I've been really heartened by when it comes to net zero is local initiatives. And I think while we see political uncertainty at the national level, and we see policy flip-flopping or rowing back, as we're seeing in the UK now, and we may in the future see in the States, for example, I think there are some fantastic initiatives, which initially I didn't think could do very much. But in the last few years, I've been more and more impressed by some of the work that I've seen, where you've got public-private partnerships, businesses large and small, actually being very open and honest together. And I'm delighted to see Melissa Rackham from OES Net Zero in Hull, where I've been supporting their great project, is on this webinar, because something remarkable has happened up there, where people running organizations, public and private sector, getting together, sharing ideas, sharing failures, sharing successes in a way that just hasn't happened before. And I think if national government could properly see the kind of progress being made at a local level, it would be inspirational and might help encourage them to provide the consistency and the joined up thinking that those local efforts are desperately calling for. I'm sure that's my 4 minutes up, but really keen to sort of hear the questions later.
Thank you, David. That's a gorgeous 4 minutes and a hopeful note. I was going to say, if you hadn't brought in that final note, that, there isn't a moment of progress in history in which a powerful and broad group of coordinated and organized people couldn't overcome entrenchment through vested interests. And I think that that's part of what we're all doing here today. We're keeping our narrative strong and coordinating up so that we can stay informed and support each other at that local level and at that international level. So really appreciate you kind of bringing the heat and the political moment back to us. We're actually on very good time here. So I'm going to be a little cheeky and ask you a follow-up question. What do governments need to hear from businesses and civil society and academia in order to activate that ambition loop, in your view?
Well, I think shining examples, and there are lots of them, of where this works and how people want to do it and how they're really making productive and constructive steps together at the local level, but with some national unlocking, whether it's grid connections or finance in the right sense or all kinds of other ways, could make a huge leap forward. And then I think the other key part that I think does motivate governments of different political persuasions is the fear of missing out. And I think what we're seeing now is that the tectonic plates of global industry are moving, obviously on a staggering scale in China, but then with Biden and the Inflation Reduction Act, and then to an extent across the EU and other countries. And I thought it was remarkable. I don't often watch it, but I do see clips of GB News, and the amazing motoring journalist Quentin Wilson was on that channel with Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Conservative politician, and who was pushing him on the, quote, failures of electric vehicles. And Quentin Wilson, rightly, I thought, didn't mention climate or sustainability. He mentioned the risk of industrial loss. You know, do you really want Britain to fall behind in this new race? And I think framing questions about this in that way actually includes a constituency that might otherwise have been completely disinterested or even hostile. So that, I think, would make governments sit up and listen, the fear of missing out.
Thank you. Government FOMO. It's a good one. And I think maybe that's something that we can work together as a network, is if people are developing that kind of thoughtful communications and policy briefs for governments who we kind of understand their agendas, that could be something that we share between ourselves. So then that's yet another call that this is a two-way street kind of network. David, thank you so much for kind of kicking us off and setting the political stage. Next, I'm going to turn to one of our speakers who's very much has the kind of background that we would want to hear from following that set of questions and answers. Ritwika Sengupta is the Net Zero Policy Manager at British Standards Institute, as I mentioned, but she also is a former senior policy advisor to the UK's Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Ritwika, David has talked a lot about the need for interoperability and consistency in policymaking, and you used to work in government, so you probably know how hard it is to coordinate across government departments as you're drafting policy. But now I suspect I know sort of a little bit about your position on how to do this, because you now work for an international standardization organization. But could you tell us a little bit more about where you think the opportunity is to start improving alignment between policies?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kaya. It's great to be here with you all today. So as Kaya mentioned, I work in the international standards system, and I'll talk a little bit about why I think that system is absolutely crucial, not just for interoperability, but actually for scaling climate accountability, not just in the global north, but across the world in every country. So just to take a step back, what do I mean by the international standards landscape? This is really the network of national bodies focused on standards that often come together at some kind of an international forum to coordinate, to bring stakeholders together and develop standards based on consensus. So, for example, as Kaya mentioned, I work at BSI, the British Standards Institute, which is actually UK's national standards body. So we are appointed by government to represent UK's national interests at that international coordination level when it comes to standardization. So, for example, we are a member of ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. You might have seen or worked with ISO standards before in your kind of various sectors. And again, similarly, other countries will have their own standards bodies. For example, France's one is called AFNOR. India's one is called Bureau of Indian Standards. They come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they are appointed by government. Sometimes they're really part of government. They're a department in government. But the crucial thing is that these national standard bodies come together at organizations like ISO at that international level and coordinate across the world to really bring in those national and regional economic and other interests into the development of a standard. So ISO's membership actually includes 170 countries at the moment. So that's quite a lot of lower to middle income countries as well, which is absolutely crucial when we're thinking about any kind of scaling of governance solutions. And the real sort of key message I want to give today about the international standards system is that really it develops standards based on consensus. So we have a slide on the conveyor belt model, which I'm sure Michelle will pop up in a second. But this idea of kind of the international standard system is built on consensus can be really seen in this conveyor belt model. So you can see here that there are lots of market-led initiatives on the right of this model. So there's voluntary initiatives, orchestration campaigns. These are really pushing the boundaries when it comes to net zero governance. But what the international standard system does is that we're really neutral. All we do is convene. So we bring all these experts and innovators together to understand what is the consensus on best practice right now. And that consensus then goes into a standard. It's as sort of simple as that, if you like. And then the second really crucial thing I think about this system is that involvement of the national bodies from across the world, because that kind of global involvement, without that, I think we cannot scale climate accountability and make it work for everybody. Of course, this system being built on consensus means that exactly that interoperability question that Kaya asked is always in the front of our minds. So if you find consensus, you figure out what works in most cases or the majority of cases. But then you give that opportunity to nations across the world to really think about their national context, their policy context, and bring those interests into the fold so that we make a standard that can work for everybody. And I think I'll stop there and pass back to you, Kaya, because I think I've done 4 minutes.
Sure. You all are very, very well behaved. I'm hoping that this network is not as well behaved as you are. We need to both have rule makers and rule breakers in this network to overcome barriers in the net zero transition. But on timekeeping, I'll take it. So, Rishika, I have a follow-up question for you, which is, how can a network like this help the public sector grow awareness about the standards out there? And what should we be doing as we build this network with governments and standard bodies in mind?
Yeah, so I think this network, the biggest opportunity, I think, Kaya, is to really connect to those public services and public bodies or public adjacent bodies that are kind of delivering invisible solutions. So I talked a lot about standard bodies and national standard bodies, but there are other counterparts that deliver sort of the other aspects of governance, like checking the standards, making sure those who are providing certification schemes are doing a good job. So, for example, in the UK, we have a national accreditation body, UCAS. We have a national measurement body, NPL, National Physical Laboratory. And those kinds of counterparts are in every country, and they really underpin policymaking. A lot of the infrastructure on which policymaking is based is often around using these services in that country's context. So if we don't empower those institutions in every country to really use their expertise for net zero, we're really missing out. We can't scale. We'll get to a point where we have these great frameworks, and then, as soon as we try and put it into practice, we haven't got the infrastructure ready. So for me, this network is an amazing opportunity to connect the huge climate action community and their passion to those national bodies, we call them quality infrastructure bodies, across the world, who are incredibly knowledgeable about how to deliver accountability, so that we can just connect those two expertise, climate action and accountability, and just scale it worldwide.
Thank you. That's such good, concrete, strategic advice. And I can see my team in the background thinking, okay, Kaya's writing down a research project for us to go and find every one of those, you call it policy adjacent bodies, and drag them into the network. So
we can help.
You can help. I want everyone to say we can help. And I think that's what this is really about. So I think as Ruchika was speaking, you might be thinking, who's missing from this conversation that needs to? This is what you would call a soft launch with really friends and family who are working on this. And it is about reaching beyond friends and family and making sure it's not what we call an echo chamber network, but a much broader network of folks who work in non-climate related work that are instrumental to the policy and regulatory landscape shifting. Speaking of people who do that extremely well, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker. Julie Siegel, as I mentioned, is a senior manager at Climate Finance for Environmental Defence Canada. Julie has been instrumental in helping to support the passage of the Climate Aligned Finance Act in Canada, which is a prime example of a government getting its act together, excuse my pun, on interoperability and ensuring that, companies are less confused by what's going on because it's all under one act. But I think it's also a really great example of policy innovation, as a huge part of what we want to talk about throughout this network is policy innovation and examples of good practice. Julie, could you get us into the gritty details?
So delighted to be here for the soft launch of the Net Zero Policy Network. This is such an important initiative, and I am glad to see it starting and growing. I'm also very glad to be talking about a specific policy, the Climate Aligned Finance Act, which is advancing here in Canada, where I'm currently based, and to be able to speak about kind of the process of something moving from voluntary to mandatory. I'll give a bit of context on myself as well, which ties into that. I used to work in sustainable investing. I managed a portfolio of impact investments at an asset owner, and that was all excellent. It was really true impact investing. But the rest of the market, certainly a few years ago, was not remotely there. And I started to think to myself, okay, I can perfect this portfolio I'm working with in a voluntary way, right? Or what if we change the rules of the game so the whole financial system is making positive impact investments, climate-aligned finance across the board? Policy is certainly needed to change that, especially a few years ago when I moved from finance to policy and civil society. When I moved 2 years ago, one of the first things I had the opportunity to work on was advising and helping to mobilize the Climate Aligned Finance Act. This is a bill introduced in the Canadian Senate. It is about 2 years old as of a few weeks ago. And it's been quite a brilliant process to see Senator Rosa Galvez, who's the lead on this bill, collating a number of global leading policies on how to truly align our financial system with climate action and net zero, and think about how to fit those for purpose in our jurisdiction here in Canada. This, of course, is focusing on the private financial sector, recognizing that all forms of finance and investment need to align with the government's commitments under the Paris Agreement and nationally, if the country is going to succeed in meeting those climate commitments of net zero by 2050 and the short-term and term targets in 2030 and sooner. What CAFA did was look at what's happening in other jurisdictions, bring together experts who are thinking on all of those pieces, and consolidate it into a single bill. So really a brilliant and thorough process of consultation, which I think is one piece that we all recognize as important for good policy delivery outcomes. Some of the key pieces here to get even more specific, looking at, I'm sure many of you are coming from EU or UK at the moment. I have been terribly envious from my side of the Atlantic to see finance integrated as a core piece of the government's as a core piece of the government's climate plan. In the European Green Deal, of course, quite a bit of leadership, I would say, on sustainable finance. In the UK at COP26, a commitment for a net zero aligned financial system. CAFA is drawing inspiration from that and emulating it, saying we can only have a credible government climate plan if that's applying, and percolating through all levels of regulation and legislation, including for the financial sector. So that overall alignment is so important. As well, drawing inspiration from global regions like the UK, thinking about, okay, what about requiring climate transition plans? And how can we make sure that moves throughout the economy? What about changing or amending, let's say, updating and future-proofing the mandate of institutions, including regulators, to say you have to be thinking about climate risks and climate resilience when making regulations across the financial sector? That's honestly only even a bit of what this very comprehensive policy is tackling, but I hope that gives a taste to show how this example is a really brilliant piece of coordination across the economy and thinking about how do we fix things in one fell swoop. Another big piece of moving this forward and to continue the conversation on it has been bringing in the voices of even more experts to call on why this is important. So one piece we just recently worked on, again, to mark this 2-year birthday anniversary of the bill since it was first introduced, we had the opportunity to bring together a number of domestic and global experts who are highlighting their experience with climate-aligned financial policy and talking about why CAFA and bills like it globally are so important. So we have a compilation video, which I can perhaps share in chat, or maybe the organizers can support with as well. But groups from former SEC regulators to progressive businesses and credit unions in Canada, all talking about we need to move from this, kind of going back to where I started, we need to move from this space of voluntary initiative and action to just simply making this table stakes across the economy. Really, as we talked about government FOMO, business FOMO, making this a new baseline for how finance works, how business works, and future-proofing our economy to do what needs to be done to deliver on net zero and the climate transition. I will maybe pause there because I'm happy to be the rule breaker in some ways, but don't want to be the first to miss out on timing.
No, not at all. It's just that I'm really curious to ask your honest take on that type of advocacy that you have just demonstrated. And so some of you have maybe already seen what Julie's talking about on LinkedIn, global finance experts expressing their support for their experience with climate-aligned finance in support of this bill. We're among friends and family. So Julie, is it too early to tell, or do you think that initiative, videos on LinkedIn from experts around the world and domestically calling for support for this bill, has that made a difference? Is that an effective tool?
This is one stage of 2 years of working on this bill to move it forward. One piece that I find I always remind myself of is that the process should be an outcome too, right? So when engaging all of these people who are participating and becoming now invested in this policy outcome, that process is an outcome in itself. That's one piece. And then a secondary piece is, absolutely you have to hope so, because these are voices that the government should be listening to in setting policy. And I don't just mean that because these are business leaders. The government should be listening to all levels of independent climate experts, of course, their whole populace. But in the interim of an election, which happens every little bit, these types of communication tools, I think, are very helpful to show policymakers real support for a policy that can either bring it to their attention or even give them, as people who are policymakers, the space to move forward with something that might seem ambitious until that normative change around it being something that's wanted happens.
I like that. A gorgeous way to put it, that the process is an outcome. I think you've really put the Climate Aligned Finance Act on the map. It was definitely not on my radar until it started popping up all over my LinkedIn. And now I know as a researcher that I can cite this as a case study of interoperable and consultative policy. So I think you've already demonstrated the outcome is the process there. thanks very much for your work on that, for highlighting best practice and some of the best of what we'd like to see out of this network. As Alex mentioned, this is not a passive network. We will be asking others to introduce videos like, what you've done. And is it too late for some of the folks on this call to submit a video themselves in support of CAFA?
Would be delighted to see more videos in support of CAFA. And I think please feel free to reach out if you're interested in that. And maybe we can also share directly some of the guidance that we prepared to help people understand what I think most people on this call probably enjoy reading legislation, but in case there are a few who don't, we do have some resources to help you avoid that.
We love that. There's some mixed reactions to that. Wonderful. Julie, thank you so much for being a leader on that and being willing to share your thoughts and your honest thoughts on the process. It's now our time to go to question and answer, which I'm going to let our lovely host, Alex, lead and turn over to you.
Thank you so much. I must admit that I don't see actually any questions submitted so far through the platform. Let me just quickly look at the chat, because I think I've seen one or two over there. So again, I can just encourage everyone to please submit your questions. If there are any issues with the question tab, then please just post them directly in the chat. We'll fish them out. So one question here I see is around civil servants with their net zero endeavors, and a group that wants to set up a community of practice for our warriors in government, like the phrasing here. Are there any specific pain points that any of you know of for our civil servants when it comes to reaching net zero? So specifically for civil servants, are there any thoughts from the group around that topic? Ritvika, I see you. Are we unmuted?
Yeah, sorry, I was looking for a hand up, but I couldn't see one. I think somebody wrote on the chat as well, one of the pain points is Drax biomass subsidies, which really hit home because I actually worked on the UK's biomass strategy. I worked on the sustainability part of it. So I fully know kind of the day-to-day management that civil servants do around and the kind of various controversies that they deal with. I think one of the key things around net zero that I really felt in my time in the civil service was having the ability to find background knowledge, because often civil servants are generalists, and that's why I love the apolitical site as well. I think it's one of the key things is that we need to empower civil servants who are often generalists to be able to go and find the right information, because they are designing policies and they are experts at designing policies, but they're not always experts in that actual subject area. And if not the information, then we need to figure out how we can connect civil servants better with subject experts across the world. That's, I think, where I see that sort of empowerment really coming.
Amazing. Thank you, Ritvika. David, I think you've also...
Well, just to say that, I've spoken at length to many civil servants who are deeply committed to the agenda and extremely frustrated, and very often find that policy initiatives get bogged down for any number of reasons, but typically in the Treasury. As soon as costs get attached and the paper has to work its way around the government machine and ends up as a requirement for spending, if there isn't massive political support, they can find their work getting stymied. I think another problem, and it's really interesting, Rebecca, hearing you talk about using external support to enable internal work, is the number of times someone in a ministry will be pushing a policy, but actually finds that it's other ministries that hold the keys. I've mentioned the Treasury already, but there are other examples. I mentioned fires in London. One ministry looks after the fire brigade, another ministry looks after wildfires. The two never talk. and and then a third ministry looks after the water companies, and getting all of that together. And I think there's a potentially very useful work to be done of scouting around other governments around the world. Who else has tried to crack this? I mean, maybe we've been hearing from Canada. Maybe they've got a brilliant idea for how you unify policy on fires and fire brigades or whatever it is. And I think, external support for however it's handled for committed but frustrated civil servants is a really key avenue.
Julie, please jump in.
Super, thanks. I like that we're reverting to old school, perhaps even elementary hand raising. I would say often engagement with elected officials is seen as more glamorous, let's say, in the eyes of civil society or business. Engaging with the minister on a particular file is often prioritized, as it should be, but the civil servants absolutely need quite a bit of supportive education, I would say, because they're often put across so many files. And I've been quite surprised to see the turnover within civil servants on different files. Let's say if you're working on something for a number of years, they might be moved to different divisions as government priority changes. So having external experts and supporters who engage very regularly with civil servants to provide, again, I'll keep using the word supportive information that they need to advance on a file is key. The other point, as I'll amplify, is that understanding what their blocks are within other parts of the bureaucracy and government, and then helping navigate that is probably the most important piece that I think can be done from our end as either public or private sector individual, or civil society or private sector individuals to move something forward. There have been a number of times where I've seen external experts have more information about what's happening across government than an internal civil servant does. So helping to navigate that, I think, is so important and an area of engagement that should not be ignored.
Thank you. So maybe to summarize, I hear a lot about information exchange and actually building up a network, I can only say, which is, of course, the topic of our project here, and especially avoid creating silos or put positively facilitating the exchange, be it now in this example in one certain government area, but also, of course, across these different stakeholders, which is exactly why Kaya and I am now very, very happy to bring this project here to life. We have only a few minutes left, so I see now, luckily, some more questions coming in, so thank you all for sharing these. I already have bookmarked one for the very end. I think that's a great way to step out of the conversation, but maybe one before that at least. So here is a question around the relevance of policy for small and medium-sized enterprises. Maybe just for context, most of you are probably aware of this, but many of the currently existing policies, they do address the large quote-unquote emitters. Just to give you perspective there once more, I had this stat that I threw at you before, around 78% of industry emissions covered by net zero commitments by such large enterprises, which are right now more and more covered by international regulation. However, please realize, and then I pass on to the panel, of course, these emissions, they don't come from the physical, usually not from the physical entity that is the large enterprise with a net zero commitment. A lot of these emissions actually sit in their value or supply chain. And whom do we find there? Well, it's a lot about small, medium-sized enterprises. So that's maybe for context quite relevant there. And with this, does anyone from the panel want to address the kind of the policy relevance for small, medium-sized enterprises?
Yeah, I would love to highlight one of the work of our partners. Bankers for Net Zero work closely with Parliament, and they also work closely with SMEs. And they have kind of a pilot project called Project Perseus, which is helping gather data with SMEs and helping simplify SME reporting. Alex, I know you at Normative have been instrumental in setting up the SME Climate Hub to reduce friction for SMEs. And I think SMEs are probably just a few years behind large corporations in being able to have leaders demonstrate that it's possible to do this reporting, even if it's a kind of pared down version of the reporting, so that then we can start showing to policymakers, here's how you set the policies and here's the level where you set them. And so we're in that conveyor belt that Ritwika showed, demonstrating best practice, testing best practice, refining best practice, and then moving that towards standards and policy. I think that's where we are with SMEs. I think leaving them out of the picture is a huge mistake from the perspective of Julie's point, which is the process is the outcome. We have to be testing policymaking with them just to get them engaged in the conversation. And that's how you change society. Because I think one of my favorite moments in political philosophy is in Václav Havel's Summer Meditations. He talks about a moment where every shop corner has a sign on the window, kind of representing support for the government, and those signs start to one by one fall down. And that was the crumbling of the empire that was not favorable at the time for many small business owners. And I think we can have such a generative and positive force by bringing them in. But that's just my view. Are there others on the panel or even in the chat who have views on this?
I think David was already raising his hand, right?
Well, just a very quick one. It's a shift of mindset from thinking that analyzing your scope 3 supply chain emissions as a burden to seeing it as an opportunity to engage with those companies who might well be SMEs and actually enabling them. I mean, perhaps even paying for them to do their own carbon accounting, and then to bring them into the fold with joining much larger companies' power purchase agreements, which are going to be cheaper. And there's a sort of enabling mindset which can be created out of what had been seen as a burden.
Ritwika, I know that you also want to add.
Yeah, just a quick one. I think sort of really great to hear all the sort of different thoughts set out. I think crucially, it's really important to have SMEs in the room when we're thinking about rule setting and the kind of frameworks that we're developing. In principle, what we want to achieve remains the same, but how we get there might be a little bit different for an SME, and what they can actually put into action might be a little bit different. My colleague Sarah Walton, who I think is on the line as well, watching, has been working quite a lot with SMEs recently on trying to understand how to help them shape their net zero journey, and actually working on a standard called Net Zero Flex, which is currently out for consultation if anyone's interested. But the idea is that creating sometimes products that are for SMEs to use, or resources that are for SMEs to use, again, which connect to that global best practice, but to just sort of make it easier for them to actually implement the actions, because the actions they implement may not be exactly the same as like a really large global company. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, and to make sure that when we're setting rules, we're engaging SMEs alongside.
100%. We couldn't agree more. And once more, that's so nice to close the loop now to coming back to the beginning, because this is exactly what this network here is all about, connecting all the different stakeholders with each other. And I want to be roughly on time here. So let's just use this one question has been asked to round up. Maybe Kaya, you do want to use it for some closing comments, so to speak. So the question here is, what's next? What are next steps with the network? Will there be a platform to learn about what other institutions are doing in order to explore potential synergies, collaboration, avenues? My short answer is yes, we are very excited about this, and I'll leave it over to Kaya to maybe use it as a closing statement.
Thank you very much, all. As we said, this is a soft launch. There's about 100 of you on the call. It's our aim within, a few months to have 1,000 people in this network, and especially those who we noticed were not in the room. Some folks we talked about, SMEs, civil servants. We want to work with you on bespoke webinars, events targeted towards more specific questions, some of which we've covered today. And so we'd like to encourage you all to reach out to us with your suggestions as to what we should do with the network. We will, at a minimum, be hosting quarterly webinars quarterly newsletters, and sharing the information of about 50 NGOs who I mentioned who are working on policy and regulation internationally. And so I don't want anyone to get the impression that this is a network started by a few people who are just, randomly coordinating. There is a huge machinery. We're tied into the UN Net Zero Policy Task Force that is advancing transition plan regulation globally and doing research on this. We have research institutes, including Oxford and Harvard and Berkeley, that we want to share research from. I saw lots of other academics on the chat. We encourage you to send in your research. And we have a gorgeous platform built by Normative, which is a website, which you'll see has kind of space holders. It's not finished, it's under construction for blog posts. So there's some sample blog posts. You can imagine that as space like for your advertising here. And it's really the opposite of advertising. It is, we're working for the good of the public, and it is a public service that we're building together. We need your help to make it a success. So please reach out to us. If you'd like to reach out to us with thoughts and questions, our generic email is netzero@ouce.ox.ac.uk. I'm sure Matilda is already putting it in the chat. And if you know us personally, also reach out by email. And my last call to action, as we always will have a call to action, this is not a passive network, invite 5 people to the network, especially those that we've mentioned, and follow Julie's recommendations to post a video on the Climate Aligned Finance Act. Amazing. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Great event.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.